So my colleague, Dr. Jordan Kuck, is going to speak tonight about the background of the Ukraine, and he's in a very good position to do this. Jordan is the Associate Professor of History here at Brevard College. He's an expert in the modern history of Northeastern Europe, and his research deals with the history of transnational fascism in the Baltic states during the interwar period. In the recent past, Dr. Kuck has published chapters in edited volumes that mark the centennial of Latvian independence. He has also been asked to contribute work to 2 forthcoming books, Dictatorship and Daily Life in 20th Century Europe, and Transnational and Transatlantic Fascism in East Central and Southeastern Europe, 1918 to 2018. Dr. Kuck's work has also appeared in the preeminent journal, Fascism, the Journal of Comparative Fascist Studies. During his career, Dr. Kuck has received a number of prestigious awards. Most recently, the University of Tennessee bestowed upon him the Young Alumni Award. In support of his research, Dr. Kuck has received a Fulbright, a U.S. Department of Education Foreign Language and Area Studies Fellowship, as well as a grant from the Association for the Advancement of Baltic States. Many of you and myself know him as a wonderful colleague and a great teacher.
Thanks, Margaret. Okay, good evening. I don't usually use a microphone, so you'll have to help me if I'm speaking too loudly or not loudly enough. So I'll begin tonight with the title of the talk, right? From frozen conflict to full-scale war. I decided to go with this title because Vladimir Putin has in the past been a bit of an expert at creating what political scientists and historians have subsequently called frozen conflicts. Russia has meddled in places like Chechnya, in Georgia, in South Ossetia, in Transnistria. I can go on, right? Creating these very complicated situations where it's not clear who's in power, how it will end, and it just seems to be sort of frozen in time. So what is happening right now in Ukraine seems to be a new trend for Putin, that we don't have a frozen conflict, we have a full-scale war. So my goal for tonight is to help you understand how we ended up here with a full-scale war. Before I do that, the point about social action, I just want to take a moment to point out that tonight's event, or the international community's focus on the war in Ukraine, should not distract our attention from other very important conflicts in the world, right? All lives matter, all deaths matter. And we have seen some really horrific conflicts over the last few years. We can talk about the current war in Yemen, where we have a terrible humanitarian crisis. The United Nations noted back in October that if nothing changed in Afghanistan, there were at least 1 million children at risk of famine over the winter. So these sorts of events, we can talk about the Rohingya Muslim, the Uyghur Muslims, right? There are many, many events around the world that deserve our attention. But it's also true that the war in Ukraine is at a magnitude that we haven't seen in a long time. One of the most powerfully nuclear-armed countries has attacked the largest geographical country in Europe itself. And it would also be important to note that this crisis in Ukraine, this war in Ukraine, is threatening to have a kind of knockoff effect on some of those other humanitarian crises I mentioned. Take, for example, the possible famine in Afghanistan. The World Food Program announced at the beginning of the war in Ukraine that unfortunately about 50% of all of the grain that is distributed around the world as part of World Food Aid comes from Ukraine. So we are at great risk of this calamity causing an sort of exaggeration or extrapolation further of other problems around the world. Okay, now to the war in Ukraine. I think for non-experts in terms of Russia, there's often some bewilderment about what's happening. As proof, we might go back to 1939 and Winston Churchill. He once said, in defining Russia, at the time the Soviet Union, that it's a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma, suggesting we just throw our hands up in the air and say, I have no idea what they're doing. So my goal tonight is not to be Churchill, to say, I have no idea why this is happening. I think if we look carefully at history and recent events, we can get a pretty good idea of what's happening. And here's my thesis for tonight's talk. This war has absolutely nothing to do with the present day. It does not have to do anything with any offense committed by Volodymyr Zelensky's government. Rather, what seems to have offended Vladimir Putin is history, the past itself. Simply put, this war in Ukraine is Putin's attempt to change history, to change past events. And thus, I would argue this tragic war in Ukraine, this disastrous war in Ukraine, reminds us of that well-known adage about history in Eastern Europe. And the adage is, the only thing certain about the future is the past will change. I'll say that again. This is a very well-known adage in the region. The only thing certain about the future is the past will change. I have some good friends in the region. And they have told me, talking to my parents and grandparents, they have said to me, history has come to life. It is haunting us again. And that made me think very much about Milan Kundera's book, The Joke. Kundera, originally from Czechoslovakia, his first major bestseller was The Joke. And the premise of that novel, and I highly encourage everyone to read it, is that history itself likes to play jokes on the people of the region. Okay, as we begin, I would argue that there are some key questions that are very deserving of our attention. And here they are. The first one is, why has Vladimir Putin launched a war now, specifically in the year 2022? Secondly, why is Putin seemingly obsessed with Ukraine? And what does he want? Thirdly, what does Putin mean when he talks about denazifying Ukraine? In a moment, I'll show you a picture from the big rally that was held at Luzhnitsky Stadium in Moscow last Friday. And the big banner behind Putin read, "For a world without Nazism." So what is he talking about when he's talking about denazifying Ukraine? Fourthly, why does Putin continually talk about an ostensible genocide that is afoot against Russian speakers in Ukraine, and not just Ukraine, elsewhere in the region as well? This is his claim. Fifthly, why has Putin accused Ukrainians of having a nuclear arms program and/or biological weapons? This claim was made by the foreign minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, at a meeting in Turkey between the Ukrainian and Russian delegates, and has subsequently been repeated at length by propagandists who work for the Kremlin. So what we're going to do is address each of these questions in turn, beginning with the first one, why now in 2022? What we're going to do is we're going to start at the largest international level with possible answers and work our way down to the very specific, maybe even hypothetical reasons in Russia for the attack now in 2022. I would argue, if we're thinking about the international context, that just like Adolf Hitler did in the interwar period, here Putin seems to be hoping that he can use democracy. Think about this for a second. He's no fan of democracy, right? He has called his version of democracy managed democracy. And it has spawned some other similar interpretations, like Viktor Orban in Hungary, another dictator who talks about illiberal democracy. So he would be very keen to use democracy against itself, right? And here I would argue he's hoping to use democracy and democratic elections against the Western powers. So 2022, is there anything unique about this year? Number one, it is a midterm election year here in the United States. And Putin suspects war is not popular with voters, right? Think back to when Russia invaded Crimea and Luhansk and Donetsk. It was 2014, a federal election year in the United States. Think back to 2008 when Russia meddled in Georgia, presidential election year in the United States. France also is having a presidential election this year, this spring. Look at Britain, right? Since Brexit, politics in Britain has been, to put it nicely, a bit of a mess, right? And some say that the Russians had a lot to do with Brexit, right? Disseminating false information about what Brexit would mean for British voters. And that perhaps Putin's been playing this long-term game here, and maybe that's giving him too much credit. But it's certainly true that Brexit has destabilized British politics, to say nothing of Boris Johnson's many scandals recently involving the violation of his own COVID protocols. Think about Germany. We have a brand new German coalition, only months into its rule. After 16 years of Merkel's steady hand, we now have a coalition of the Social Democrats and the Greens and the Liberals. And perhaps Putin thought, aha, well, the German government, they're brand new, they're not prepared for this. Another possible international context to consider is that due to former President Donald Trump's very public rift with NATO, perhaps Putin hoped that any remaining discord and dissension within NATO might lead to the inability to respond meaningfully to the invoking of Article 5 of NATO, which says an attack on one is an attack on all. Okay, now let's turn to Russia itself. Some 10 or 11 months ago, Vladimir Putin signed into law constitutional changes that were voted upon in 2020. There were all kinds of constitutional amendments. One made homosexuality illegal. Another said that Russians must believe in God. But probably the most substantial one is what we're calling the resetting of terms. Putin was facing yet again the end of his term limits. He's done all kinds of shenanigans to get around this, right? Swapping with Dmitry Medvedev the role of prime minister, and then after that, castling himself, the chess move, right? That led to all of those protests in 2011. This time, he's trying to get around the term limits by changing the Constitution, and it's indeed happened. So now he can, if he wants, at least ostensibly, continue to rule Russia until the year 2036. So he had to get those constitutional changes enacted to feel safe, right? The next thing that I would draw your attention to is there's been a lot of speculation since the year 2018, 2019, that Putin might have some health problems. We know for a fact he's got a bad back and that he takes a lot of painkillers. But more recently, there's been speculation that he may have Parkinson's or some kind of degenerative disease. And just for fun, I guess, we can be Putin watchers here. We can look at some recent photos of Putin. Here, meeting with the dictator, essentially, of Turkey, Recep Erdogan. And Putin always does this with his left hand. He doesn't use it much, and if it's not comfortably resting on something, he's prone to holding it with the other hand. Here you can see, right, kind of an unnatural way, you might say, of placing his left arm. Here with the dictator of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko. And here from his totally bizarre speech on the night before the invasion of Ukraine. And again, if you watch the video of it, the left hand just sits there on the desk, doesn't really move. Who knows, right? The Kremlin does not disclose any information about Putin's health. About 3 or 4 months ago, Putin disappeared for a while. And there was speculation that perhaps he had COVID-19 or that someone in his inner circle had COVID-19. What we do know is that Putin has increasingly become a germaphobe at a very high level. And when he now meets with members of a cabinet, this is what it looks like. He is now, I would argue, totally atomized. And some, I don't know, psychoanalysts suggest that he's kind of become deranged, right? And if you perhaps follow international news, just yesterday, Alexander Lukashenko of Belarus, in an interview said, "I promise you, I know Putin very well. He's totally sane. He's very healthy. He's an athlete." Oftentimes, if you have to ask an ally to make that kind of statement, there might be something there, right? So one speculation about why 2022. Maybe Putin knows he doesn't have much time left, and this is a kind of swan song of sorts, aimed at trying to bolster his legacy as one of the all-time great Russian leaders. Lastly, in terms of why 2022, specifically February, the invasion of Crimea began in February of 2014. And so Putin seemingly wanted to ensure that he could drum up support for the war by holding exactly the kind of thing he held last Friday in that giant stadium in Moscow to celebrate the 8-year anniversary of the successful, quote-unquote, taking of Crimea, right? Okay, why is Putin seemingly obsessed with Ukraine, and what does he want? Here we have this nice picture of a much younger Putin looking at a map. I would argue that Putin's a kind of old school political leader. He's obsessed with physical geography. And here we have to understand that for Russians, the Ukrainian lands are seen as the core of Russian identity. Indeed, there was this propaganda that came out when the war started in Ukraine saying, "Mother Russia, welcome Ukraine home." When we try to explain the origins of the term Russian and of Russian identity, we have to go back to the Kievian Ruse, which is considered to be the first ever Russian quote-unquote state. We still don't know for sure where this Rus comes from, but the best theory we have is that it has to do with the Vikings, right? This is probably not particularly well known, but in addition to the Vikings going west and south, They also went east and south. And they would ply the waterways of the region, trying to arrive in Constantinople for trade. And one of the most valuable trade goods that they would bring down to Constantinople were slaves. And we think that the term Rus comes from the old Swedish word ruspegar, meaning men who row. Yeah? And it seems that over time, the Viking elite leaders who came and settled and intermarried with the local Slavs came to take on this new identity as a kind of hybrid Viking Slavic people. And outsiders came to call them the Rus. So, for example, by the 6th century AD, we have records from the Byzantine Empire of emperors referring to the people of the region as the Rus. And again, it's not just the local Viking rulers, but also the local Slavic people who have now intermarried. All of them were referred to as the Rus. So if we're going to just for a second think about the Slavic people, right? You can talk about West Slavs, for example, Czechs or Slovaks or Poles. We also have South Slavs, like in the Balkans. So when we're talking about the Rus here, we're really talking about present-day Belarusians, Russians, and Ukrainians. And they all shared this identity as the Rus. That is until the Mongols came in the 13th century and toppled the Kievian Ruse. At which point we get a kind of distinction between Russians proper and other East Slav nations like Belarusians and Ukrainians. Because after the Kievian Rus fell, the center of Russian civilization began to go east. And this is not surprising. That's where the Mongols came from, right? And it's actually the beginning of that centuries-old question for the Russians. Are we an eastward-looking people or a westward-looking people? Okay, I'm greatly simplifying history here for the sake of time. But the next most important state we should talk about is the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, or the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Went by two different names. During the 18th century, second half of the 18th century, that long-forgotten state was partitioned 3 different times by Russia, Prussia, and Austria. So the lands of present-day Ukraine now were splintered into belonging to 3 different states. And that is how we get, for example, the very different sort of architectural and cultural feels of present-day Ukraine. This is Lviv in the west. And if you look at the picture here, it looks very Germanic. This is no accident. In fact, the Germans called Lviv Lemberg, right? Whereas, if you're talking about the portion of present-day Ukraine over here, this ended up in the Russian Empire. And if you're talking about the city Kharkiv, it looks, it feels much more Russian than Lviv. Okay, moving forward. At the end of the First World War, all of the empires of the region collapsed. The Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire. In 1918, having been inspired by nationalism, the Ukrainians attempted to create a modern-day Ukraine. But because of the historic differences between Western Ukraine and East Ukraine, there were actually two Ukraines. Here we have a map showing us the West Ukrainian People's Republic, with the capital of Lviv. And in the east, the Ukrainian People's Republic. Two different states, yeah? What happened to these two states? They were both brutally crushed by the Bolsheviks during the Russian Civil War. What the Ukrainians did get, though, was not an independent Ukraine, but the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, right? The Bolsheviks very much encouraged national minorities to practice their mother tongue. So there was an old formula in the Soviet Union dealing with nationalism. The formula was socialist in content, nationalist in form. And the Bolsheviks said, sure, we'll permit you to have a Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And Putin, in his wild speech on the night before the invasion, blasted Lenin and the Bolsheviks for stupidly permitting Ukrainians to have their own Soviet Socialist Republic. He said, that's ridiculous. They should have just belonged to the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic. Next important phase here, if we're trying to understand Russian relationship with Ukraine. During Joseph Stalin's first 5-year plan, the single most important aspect of that 5-year plan was collectivization. To try to get the people in the countryside to join the collective farms, to hand over their beasts of burden and all of their agricultural tools. Russians like to talk about not carrot and stick, but gingerbread and the whip. First, Stalin tried gingerbread. And when that didn't work, he said, let's use the whip. And the whip here was to call Ukrainians in particular, but other wealthy farmers, and you probably all know, Ukraine has tremendously fertile soil. So there were a lot of pretty well-off farmers there. Stalin branded them, labeled them kulaks, which in Russian means fist. So you think of like a child fighting over a toy, right? Give that to me, it's mine, and you grasp it. Stalin said, we have to smash them and open up their fist. And look at this propaganda here. We have a wealthy kulak farmer who just happens to be wearing yellow and blue, hoarding grain, right? Wearing the cross, violating essentially all of the teachings of Soviet communism. And Stalin makes clear, right? Your days are numbered. We're encircling you. Ultimately, collectivization in Ukraine looked like this. Wanting to teach the Ukrainian people a lesson, and perhaps a lesson that would be disseminated across the Soviet Union, Stalin ordered a man-made famine in Ukraine, in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Now, some historians point out that this famine coincided with bad weather. Just like we had a dust bowl in the United States and that part of Europe, they too had a warm, dry period. It didn't rain as much. But this is not the cause of that famine. Rather, Stalin ordered that food be confiscated from Ukraine and the borders to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic sealed so that people could not escape the famine. This took place mostly from 1930 to 1932. These are not children who were victims of the Nazi Holocaust or Shoah. These are Ukrainian children who were victims of what the Ukrainians call the Holodomor, or the Ukrainian hunger, famine, genocide. This is a picture from Kharkiv, and we see here victims of the famine. Unlike the Germans, who have tried to make amends for their crimes against, I don't know, it died, who have tried to make amends for their crimes against humanity, the Russian or Soviet government has said nothing. Even to this day, they will not admit that this happened. In 2003, the United Nations, for the first time, admitted, yes, this did happen. And they put the number of dead at 7 to 10 million. Everyone has heard of the Holocaust or Shoah, right? How many people have heard of the Ukrainian Holodomor? 7 to 10 million dead. We still don't know the exact number. Some estimates have it as low as 3 million. Additionally, from 1934 to 1938, Stalin also launched the Great Purges, his cleansing of the party. And again, so-called kulaks from Ukraine were rounded up and sent to gulag camps to do hard labor. Tragically, just this morning, a member of the Ukrainian parliament gave an interview on NPR and said, yeah, you know, these Russians, they have these humanitarian corridors now, so that people in cities like Mariupol can leave the city and escape the war. But Putin has made clear these corridors do not go to the west. You cannot become a war refugee and go to Poland or Slovakia or Romania or Lithuania. No, you have to go to Russia. And this member of the Ukrainian parliament said today that there are reports that people who are being evacuated out of Kharkiv and Mariupol are now being taken away as far as Siberia. And she ended saying, I guess it's the gulags again for Ukrainians. Very bitter experiences for the Ukrainian people for the first, let's say, 30 years of the Soviet Union. After Stalin died in 1953, we get Nikita Khrushchev, who happened to be of Ukrainian heritage. And wanting to improve relations between Moscow and the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, in 1954, Khrushchev gave to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic Crimea, right? And so in 2014, Putin attempted to rewrite that history by gaining it back. Next thing to mention very quickly about history. With the fall of the Soviet Union, 1990, 1991, there were a lot of discussions about what would happen to NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which had been established in 1949 as part of the Cold War. James Baker, who was Secretary of State for the George H.W. Bush administration, arrived in Moscow here with Mikhail Gorbachev, and he said, my friend, don't worry. NATO will not move even 1 inch to the east. Putin loves to remind us of this. But what Putin and others do not seem to understand is that the United States government is not a dictatorship. We have in our government the freedom to disagree with each other. And in this case, James Baker had a very different opinion than the Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, who said, I think we should welcome all of these new countries who have broke away from the Soviet Union into NATO. right? And indeed, that is what happened. But we also should recognize this. These post-Soviet countries that have joined NATO, they were a little hesitant in the early 90s. Should we consider it? I don't know. And then Russia got involved in a terrible war in Chechnya. And I would argue there was no long-term plan, no conspiracy theory on the part of the United States to strong-arm the countries of Eastern Europe into joining NATO. No. It was the foreign policy of the Russian government, meddling in what they call the near abroad, that convinced the people of the region, we must join the European Union and NATO. Now, on this point, we should just briefly note Ukraine. This question of whether or not to join the EU and NATO has been a serious point of contention. It has led to at least 2 revolutions in Ukraine. The Orange Revolution. There was a disputed election between Viktor Yushchenko and Viktor Yanukovych. Yanukovych being the pro-Russian candidate. Ultimately, that sided, as a result of the Orange Revolution, with Yushchenko. And then the Maidan Revolution that ousted Viktor Yanukovych in part because he was preventing any kind of progress in terms of Ukrainians turning to the West and possibly joining NATO and the European Union. So I would make the argument, this is the most lengthy point of tonight's talk, that Putin is trying to ensure that Ukraine does not fully break away from the Russian world. And his hope is that indeed, if he can make Ukraine return to Mother Russia, as the propaganda stated, that he would go down as one of the all-time greats. Okay, what does Putin mean by denazifying Ukraine? Here is the aforementioned picture from last Friday of this massive rally in Moscow. And we have here this banner which reads, "For a world without Nazism and for Russia." And you probably have seen in the news the use of the Latin letter Z on all of the Russian equipment. So interestingly, on the posters here, they forwent the Cyrillic script and added the Latin Z as part of the propaganda. So what on earth is he talking about when he talks about denazifying Ukraine? This is just my interpretation. Of course, I have no idea what exactly he means. But I would say, number one, he seems to be trying to remove from Ukraine any semblance of Germanic influence, beginning with nationalism itself, which was invented by the Germans, specifically the German philosopher Johann Gottfried von Herder, who coincidentally lived much of his life in Eastern Europe, wondering what makes a Latvian different from a Russian, from a German, from a Swede, right? And from that kernel of his idea sprang forth nationalism as a theory, leading to Ukrainians wanting their own nation state. So perhaps we should get rid of all these German influences, including that stupid idea of nationalism. Secondly, during World War II, having had their attempt at independence crushed by the Bolsheviks, having experienced a famine, genocide, and the Great Purges, when the Nazis came in 1941, they were smart and understood the Ukrainians, they would really like not to be part of the Soviet Union any longer. So the Nazi SS, right, that elite unit of the Nazi military, invited the Ukrainians as well as other ethnic groups in the region. This is true of Latvians, it's true of Estonians, of Lithuanians. They were all told, we'll permit you to create what the Germans called Schutzmannschaften. Sometimes you'll see in history books they shorten it to Shuma. They were all Ukrainian battalions, officially part of the SS, although they operated semi-autonomously, with Ukrainian as the language of command. Now, Ukrainians did not join this because they were ardent Nazis. Most of them joined because they thought, this is our chance to get revenge against the Soviets and to fight for Ukrainian independence. Tragically, it is also true, though, that while working alongside of the SS and fighting for Ukrainian independence, many of them did get involved in crimes against humanity, including the mass killing of Jews. And this man is at the epicenter of the controversy over how to remember the Ukrainian Schutzmannschaften. His name is Stepan Bandera. He was a very important Ukrainian nationalist during the interwar years when there was no Ukraine. He actually lived in Poland. During the war, he collaborated. He had a kind of a contentious relationship with the Nazis. First, they put him in prison. Then they realized we could actually use this guy, so they released him. And as the Soviets began to push westward, the Germans said to Bandera, you should organize some kind of resistance movement. So he did. Ultimately, it failed. Ultimately, he ended up, after the war, moving to Munich. In 1959, a member of the KGB killed him while he was in Munich. This is a picture from the Maidan Revolution, when the pro-Russian president Viktor Yanukovych was toppled. Draw your eyes, please, to the image of this man. That is Stepan Bandera. When Putin talks about denazifying Ukraine, he sees an image like this. And he says, wait a minute, this guy collaborated with the Nazis. Clearly, he's a fascist. Clearly, he's a Nazi. To give you an idea of how polarizing his legacy, Bandera's, is, Viktor Yushchenko tried to award posthumously Bandera with the highest award one can win in Ukraine. But then when Viktor Yanukovych came in, it was canceled. Some people consider him a hero, others say he committed crimes against humanity. It's very complicated. I would also add here in terms of why he's talking about denazifying, that absolutely Putin is playing up one of the tropes of Soviet history. That the so-called Great Patriotic War, World War II, was one of the great, remarkable achievements in the history of the Soviet Union. Nobody could defeat the Nazis except us, and the world should thank us. After the Second World War, throughout occupied Eastern Europe, the Soviets ordered the construction of these so-called victory over fascism monuments. This one happens to be from the city of Riga, Latvia, where I lived. Since 2007, there has been a lot of talk in the region of Eastern Europe. Can we get rid of these? They remind us of Soviet occupation. The first country to attempt to do this was Estonia in 2007. The proposal was not to destroy the monument or the statues, and here you should be thinking about parallels with our own country and debates about monuments and what they mean. Not to destroy it, they just wanted to move it out of downtown Tallinn to the suburbs. Do you know how Putin responded? He launched the first ever in world history case of cyber warfare, crippling the country of Estonia, which, if you don't know, is very technologically advanced, having invented Skype and many other things. This was a message: do not touch these monuments. And the people of the region, they all know about the debate with these monuments. So I would say this is also Putin kind of poking the ribs of the people of the region about the legacy of the Great War and these monuments. Okay, why does Putin continually talk about a genocide against Russians in Ukraine and elsewhere? First, we need to understand the term genocide and the historic disagreements about what this word means. The word was coined by this man, Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jew, during the war, in reference to what was happening to the Jewish people. After the war, as the international powers and the United Nations were working on the Genocide Convention, enshrined into law in 1948, they had a substantial disagreement about what it means. Lemkin wanted to include in the definition persecution of one's language or culture in a systematic way. Guess which country vetoed that proposal? The United States. Because if that would have been included in the definition, like that, the United States would have been guilty of genocide against the Native Americans. But Lemkin vehemently protested. He said, what does it mean to be alive if you are deprived of your mother tongue and your identity? So here, Putin seems to be taking that old debate and bringing it back to life, because he likes to claim that today the largest diaspora in the world is the Russian one. He claims there are at least 30 million Russians living outside of Russia, and that these people are being ruthlessly persecuted. Let me give you an example. In the case of Latvia, if you are a Russian speaker and you would like to have citizenship in Latvia, you have to take a language exam to prove that you know Latvian, at least at an elementary level. So let me be clear. You can be born in Latvia, but if you come from a Russian-speaking family, you are not granted citizenship at birth. You just have to prove that you know something about the language. And the Latvians say, what's the big deal? It's Latvia. It's our language, Latvian. If you want to live here, you have to at least know a little bit. Many Russian speakers refuse, on principle and also influenced by propaganda from the Kremlin, not to take that exam. So these people are non-citizens. They are not citizens of Latvia. They are not citizens of the European Union. They are not citizens of the Russian Federation. They have a special gray passport as a non-citizen. And do you know what? Tapping into the culture wars in America, Putin has claimed these people are being canceled. It's cancel culture, right? And I'm going to stop it. I'm going to rescue these people from their persecution. Tangentially, I would say this question about genocide is also linked to the one about denazifying, right? Putin would point to this and say, as long as these people continue to worship Bandera, who knows, they might commit genocide against Russians. Last thing to note on this question, it sometimes gets as ludicrous as this. Russian athletes have been banned as of late from competing for their country in the Olympics. They cannot represent Russia because Russia's been involved in some serious doping scandals, right? Rather than admit, yeah, we've been giving our athletes steroids, Putin says, see, it's even gotten to the extent of the persecution against Russians that they will not let us represent our country in the Olympics. Okay, why has Putin accused Ukrainians of having nuclear arms and/or biological weapons? The CIA and the MI6 from Britain have suggested that perhaps this is a false flag that might portend Putin's use of these exact weapons in Ukraine. And I hope to God that does not happen. My interpretation is a little bit different. I think what Putin is doing here is rubbing salt in the wound of a mistake, perhaps, that Ukrainians made. And that today many Ukrainians, maybe simplistically, but nonetheless are regretting. When Ukraine became an independent country in 1991, overnight, they became the third most powerful nuclear country in the world. And I'm not talking here about nuclear power plants, although they have a lot of those. They had nuclear weapons, a lot of them, surpassing even Britain and France in terms of the number of nukes. Well, this greatly worried the United States. And so the Clinton administration managed to convince President Kravchuk of Ukraine to hand over the nukes, all of them, in what became called the Budapest Memorandum, signed in January of 1994. And we see here Clinton and Yeltsin and Kravchuk celebrating this deal. So in the subsequent years, all of Ukraine's nuclear weapons were removed and destroyed. Now, this might be overly simplistic thinking, but many Ukrainians today are thinking, my God, why did we give them all away? We could have used those. And I have to say, this is a very upsetting lesson, if in fact that's the true lesson. Because as we try to work on non-proliferation and try to convince countries like Iran, for example, not to develop nuclear weapons, this lesson might suggest, why would I do that? We need nuclear weapons to protect ourselves. So again, maybe my interpretation is wrong, but I think Putin, who very much is interested in history, is rubbing some salt in the wounds. Okay, as I wrap up here, and then we're going to have some guest remarks on Zoom, I have this question. Could this disastrous war in Ukraine actually lead to Putin's fall, assuming that indeed he doesn't have Parkinson's and is not nearing the end? I have no idea, but history suggests maybe. Because going all the way back to the beginning of the 19th century, the only time we have seen meaningful change or reform in Russia is when there has been a disastrous, stupid war. It was the failure of the Crimean War in the middle of the 1800s that led to the great reforms of Tsar Alexander II, which, for example, ended serfdom finally in Russia. It was the failed Russo-Japanese War in 1904 and 1905 that led to the 1905 revolution that came this close to toppling the Romanov dynasty. It was the woeful war of World War I that indeed toppled the Romanov dynasty and led to the Bolsheviks. It's complicated, but certainly the calamity that was the war in Afghanistan, not ours, the Soviet one, it certainly hastened and helped the demise of the Soviet Union. And now we have this one. And if the war continues to go as disastrously as it has thus far for the Russians, one has to wonder, is Putin's fall in the offing? For example, reportedly anyway, Putin had the chief of the foreign branch of the FSB, the secret police, arrested and put under house arrest because apparently he gave Putin bad information about what would happen were he to invade Ukraine. Okay, at this point, I'm going to turn things over to a colleague up at UNC Asheville. Wait, I have to get out of the presentation here. Okay, here. This is Dr. Oksana Love, and we agreed that she was going to introduce herself in full. So can you hear us, Oksana? Okay, yes, we can hear you.
Hello everyone, I can hardly see how many people are there, but here we go, thank you. My name is Oksana Love, and I am a lecturer at UNC Asheville. I am not a historian or political science person. I have a PhD in chemistry, so I'm teaching chemistry at Asheville. But the reason why I'm here to kind of speak with you a little bit is because of my heritage. I'm originally from Lviv, Ukraine, and I moved here to Western North Carolina about 20 years ago. Asheville became my home in America. So I did my undergraduate degree here at UNC Asheville, and after that I went to Washington, D.C., to Georgetown to complete my PhD. After that I did postdoctoral work at the DoD lab, doing chemistry research. And after that, I got an opportunity to come back and be faculty at my alma mater. So I very happily came back with my husband, and now we have 2 kids. So as I mentioned, I'm not an expert in history or anything along those lines, but I just wanted to chat a little bit and introduce hopefully some of the concept, like the main concept in Ukraine, and then hopefully I can talk a little bit about what's going on and ask you to support Ukraine a little bit. So I put together a few slides, and hopefully you, I apologize already, but it's going to be more informal sort of a presentation. So I wanted to start with the Ukrainian flag. I think you've seen this around the TV and everywhere, and I just kind of wanted to explain first of all what does it mean. I apologize, I have like a double sound going on, so I'm a little bit slow. So the blue color means represents the sky, blue sky, and then the yellow color represents field of...
Yeah, we can hear you.
Sorry, to just repeat myself, the blue represents blue sky and the yellow represents fields of wheat. So Ukraine has been the breadbasket of Europe for many decades, and wheat is one of the main grains that Ukraine produces. However, there are other, obviously, major components like beets and beets, sugar beets. So sugar is, I think Ukraine is one of the largest exporters of sugar, actually beet sugar, to Russia. And I think right now they're struggling a little bit from the sugar standpoint. So I know that we've seen this map many, many times, but I still want to kind of to bring it up again and to point out that Ukraine is one of the largest countries in Europe. So I think it's something important to keep in mind. The current population in Ukraine was about 45 million people. I've heard here in the United States that people refer to the size of Ukraine and like a Texas state. So imagine having 45 million people living in Texas. It would be quite a dense state. So Ukraine is bordering with a few countries. As you all know, Russia has quite a big part, the eastern part of the Ukraine, and then Belarus is up north, and then on the west it's Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Moldova. So as was mentioned in the previous topic, right, we have a clear kind of differentiation between the east part of the Ukraine and the west part of the Ukraine. And historically, as was just discussed, the west part of Ukraine was, under Poland and then Austria-Russia, while the eastern part of the Ukraine was mostly under the Soviet regime. So there's definitely some differentiation in language, but also in architecture as well. And you already seen quite a few examples. I also put a few slides together just to give you an idea how things looked like. So this is Kiev, just few pictures from Kiev, which is the capital. So Kiev is about 3 million people. It's the 7th most populous city in Europe. So it's a really large city in retrospect, and it was still growing and growing. It's becoming a metropolis in a way. Kiev is an incredibly beautiful city. It has a lot of really old architecture, and it's a good mix also between this Western European, but also this Soviet architecture in a way. There's hundreds of different churches in Kiev, and you can see just some examples right here. They're all incredibly beautiful. They go back, who knows how many centuries ago. So in Ukraine, the main religion is Greek Orthodox, which is very closely related to the Russian Orthodox Church. So I'm sure things will probably change soon. And the second religion in Ukraine is usually Catholic. But in Ukraine, you will find a lot of other actually religions. Ukrainians are very open to that. So far, I believe nothing was destroyed close to downtown in Kiev, so let's hope that continues. Another example is Odessa, and Odessa is a southern capital of Ukraine. And Odessa is unique in its own right. It's also an incredibly beautiful city. It's a port city. It's right there on the Black Sea. It's about 1 million population, and Odessa is unique in a way because it was a place again where it was a traveling. So it has a more like a Mediterranean vibe to it in a way. Odessa has one of the most beautiful opera theaters, and this is just the pictures on the left. It's actually considered one of the most beautiful opera theaters in Europe. So I think I know now they tried to, although there's nothing happening yet in Odessa, they're afraid that it might, so I know they've been protecting this theater to make sure that things stay intact. This is a picture of Kharkiv, and Kharkiv, as actually was mentioned, as you can see here, it's slightly different architecture. But Kharkiv is one of the biggest cities also in Ukraine, and it's a really old city as well. So it's about 1.5 million people. It was founded in the 1600s. Unfortunately, Kharkiv has been under siege for the past 2 weeks, but there's still hope in a way that one day it will stop and we can still have the beautiful city. And lastly, I'm biased to it, Lviv, as already pictures were in previous presentation. I am from Lviv, so it's the western part of the Ukraine. The usual city would be about 800,000 people, although right now I think we have a few millions because of the refugee crisis. Lviv is one of the main cultural centers of Ukraine. It's built in 12th century. It's incredibly beautiful, and hopefully you can see it from the pictures. It has a museum, theaters, and very, very big art scene. So we have a lot of artists and poets. So I'm definitely very, very biased to Lviv, and I can speak about it a lot. But right now, Lviv has been like a place where basically a majority of the refugees traveling through. And it's incredible to see how my friends, and because again, I was 20 when I moved, so I wasn't that old, so I have a lot of my friends there and families, and it's incredible to see how community comes together to help everyone. All these theaters are now full with beds. Every single big single rooms, everything is just filled with mattresses, and to make sure that everyone is fed and have medical help, especially kids, because there's a lot of kids that are bringing in through Lviv and then go to Poland. Although a lot of people are still waiting in Lviv, so Lviv is quite packed. Anyways, I wanted to introduce two things just from Ukrainian standpoint, and just to kind of introduce you to two most important symbols of Ukraine. And one of the symbols is vyshyvanka. Vyshyvanka is an embroidery, and embroidery is most of the time is on shirt. I'm not sure if any of you can see me, but I'm wearing one of the vyshyvanka. And vyshyvanka is a very unique Ukrainian way, and it's really old way of not just embroidering shirts, but also other things. And this is just a map of Ukraine, as you can see here, which is quite unique, that each county in Ukraine actually have their own main way, or like the main sort of concept. And back in the day, actually, people could figure it out which county the other people were from based on their vyshyvanka. Vyshyvanka became a really big symbol, especially when the Ukraine became independent. And throughout the country, people were celebrating it. Usually vyshyvankas are worn on the big holidays like Christmas, Easter, weddings, birthdays. And I believe about a decade ago they did Vyshyvanka's Day. And one of those examples is right here on the left, and this is actually from Mariupol, where kids were celebrating Vyshyvanka Day. And we all know what's happening in Mariupol right now, so it's heartbreaking. But vyshyvankas became actually quite a big deal in the past, I think, 5 years, because one of the Ukrainian designers took it to the next level. And it's almost made it to the fashion runway in New York, but this is the picture on the right. It became really a modern way of modernizing vyshyvanka. So another symbol that is really well known to Ukraine is pisanki. Pisanki are Ukrainian Eastern eggs. They are done, maybe starting to be made maybe like 2 weeks before the Easter, and it's a huge tradition. I mean, even me and my friends would always go. We would get together in somebody's house, and we would paint pisanki. There's a specific way of doing them then, because it's not just as simply as coloring, but you have to use a wax resist on them, and then you put them in one color and another color. So it's a process. It's a definitely time-consuming process, but it creates incredibly beautiful, beautiful eggs. I'm gonna skip this slide since we kind of short on time, but I just want to kind of to bring back to where we are. According to 2013, from the American Community Survey, we have about 1,200 people from Eastern Europe here in the actual area. There are a lot of Moldovan people, about 450, and then we have a Russian, Poland, and Belarusian community as well. So we do have about 450, 500 Ukrainian people in the area. A lot of people come here through as a religious refugee, so we have a big community here, and there are quite a lot of churches for that. But there are also other people, of course, who are not associated with their religion. And one of the examples that I wanted to bring and kind of share, and hopefully one day maybe you will decide to do this, there's a Ukrainian artist, her name is Brevard College, and she is located at River Arts District here in Nashville. And actually her specialty is to do pisanki. So she has different workshops for folks who want to try it. She has all the setup there. It's a really great experience, and it's fun because you can take pisanka home. So I think I'm gonna wrap up, but I wanted to get to the most important part, I guess, of why I'm here. As most of you know, the Ukrainian crisis currently is one of the biggest one in history. So about more than 10 million people have been displaced from their home, and about 3 million people that left Ukraine, half of which were children. So the help is needed and support is needed, there are so many different ways that one can right now support and donate. I think there's a lot of many donations opportunities, but I wanted to bring these four to your attention. One is Razom. Razom is the actually Ukrainian-based, American-Ukrainian-based organization here in the United States, and they basically provide a response for purchasing medical supplies, and they actually are there on the field. So the help goes directly towards Ukrainian people who are fighting or need humanitarian help. Another one is CARE, and that's again, it's a humanitarian organization that provides food, water, and hygiene kits. Red Cross, as we all know this organization, and one that I really would like to point out, it's a World Central Kitchen chef, Jose Andres, has been feeding thousands of people on the border in Poland, but also now he's in Kiev and Odessa, and I believe they were just making it to Kharkiv as well. So if you are interested in any of them, or you're interested in specific possibilities to donate specifically to the Ukrainian organization, I have the list of those as well. I have quite a few friends of mine in Lviv that are organizing humanitarian help to the soldiers, but also to the people who are there. So if you would like to know any of that information, I will gladly provide it. So just please shoot me an email and I will give you all the information. So on that, I want to thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming. It was an incredibly interesting talk. Thank you for having me. And please stand as you can. Please help and donate. Thank you.
Thank you, Oksana. Mm-hmm. Okay, any questions?
So Putin declared some regions of Ukraine as independent regions. So who are the pro-Russian separatists, and what is their role in all of this?
Okay, who are the pro-Russian separatists? What is their role? That's an almost impossible thing to know because, for example, we don't know if these pro-Russian separatists are actually bankrolled by Putin himself, by other oligarchs. So you'll probably remember from the war in Iraq, right? Hearing about Blackwater Ops. Remember this group? There's a similar kind of group, and indeed Putin seems to have studied that US war and said, wait a minute, there's like a loophole here that if you have like a private security firm, there are like no laws essentially dictating. So it's called the Wagner Group, and it's bankrolled by one of the oligarchs, in particular Igor Sechin. And we don't, frankly, know. Like, are these people genuine in their affinities, or are they being paid to say and do these things? We don't know. Certainly when there was the election in Crimea, the vast majority of the people who did vote in that election said, yeah, we would like to go to Russia. In this case, it's very unclear. But yes, he has announced, this was ostensibly one of the reasons for the invasion, to protect the Luhansk and Donetsk independent regions, right? And it seems as though that's one thing that Putin is asking Volodymyr Zelensky to do, is to agree to let go of much of eastern Ukraine.
I've read recently that a high-ranking member of the German government retired and was hired onto the board of directors of Gazprom.
Yep.
Is that true?
Yes. This is the so-called Audi Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder, known as the Audi Chancellor because he's been married 4 times, you know, the 4 rings of Audi. Yeah, he was a member of the Social Democrats, so the current Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, same party, and Scholz has called out Schroeder and said, you've got to condemn this. He really hasn't yet. When he retired as Chancellor, and he's been friends with Putin for a long time, he immediately joined the board of Gazprom. And, well, I should back up. When he was Chancellor, he helped pave, in terms of regulation, the building of Nord Stream 2, the second big gas pipeline in the Baltic Sea. And once he left out, he kind of entered that revolving door of sorts of high-profile positions, joined Gazprom, and then he was also the chairman of the stockholders for Nord Stream 2. So indeed, this has been embarrassing for the Germans that one of the most important chancellors of the post-war period is in cahoots with Putin, all for money.
Do they seem to be a little short on enthusiasm for stopping Putin in Germany?
The Germans?
I mean, kind of not as enthusiastic as they could be.
Well, you have the long-term legacy of Nazism and the Germans saying, we are demilitarized, basically, right? Like, that's not who we are. And so it was very surprising, and Putin may have miscalculated here, when Olaf Scholz said, you know what, going forward, we're going to spend a lot more money on our military. And we're going to send, actually, directly weapons to Ukraine. They've never done this, right? So this was very surprising, particularly because the current German coalition are socialists and Greens, the people who you would think are the most anti-war, right? Anti-military are saying, no, things have to change in Germany, right? And they've now agreed to spend a lot more on money and to ship weapons to the Ukrainians directly. So I think the situation in Germany is in flux as we speak.
But it's changed just in the last 2 weeks. Right?
Yes, absolutely. I would say in the last 4 weeks, German policy got flipped on its head, you could almost say. Mm-hmm. And I don't think Putin was expecting that. Very good question.
So, several weeks ago, at the beginning of this conflict, President Zelensky of Ukraine really wanted to join NATO, and he wanted NATO to get involved, everything. But just in the past few days, he's come out and said, I acknowledge that we cannot join NATO.
Yeah.
Some people say that that's a result of his negotiations with the Russians. He's understanding that if the conflict is to end, he has to drop that that aspiration. I'm sure you've seen the Mearsheimer talk from 2015, where Mearsheimer, who's a political scientist at the University of Chicago, known for hard power offensive realism, he basically said that what's happening in Ukraine is the fault of the West permitting NATO expansion to happen, and that what should have happened is the United States and Russia should have worked together to make Ukraine a neutral buffer state between the NATO bloc and Russia. That didn't happen. Of course, Ukraine, as a democracy, has their own aspirations. So do you think that to get to an end of the conflict, if Zelensky's at the point of acknowledging that Ukraine can't join NATO, do you see Ukraine having to voluntarily submit as a neutral buffer state that's managed by external powers as the pathway to ending this conflict?
That's a really good question. I mean, technically, the Budapest Memorandum, when they agreed to hand over the nukes, said Russia and the United States will recognize and protect Ukrainian sovereignty if they hand over the nukes. So they already have on paper this promise of protection, which, I mean, Zelensky in a press conference very early on, maybe even day one, said, what about the Budapest Memorandum? Give me some help here, right? He's like, I don't need a ride, remember? I need weapons. And so, yes, he's changed his stance on joining NATO. Not the EU. He's still pressing forward with the EU, but there does seem to be a recognition that this is going to be one area, maybe that the Ukrainians, the government at least, is willing to move for Putin to stop. And the US, yeah, I don't know. I mean, Ukraine has had this kind of unofficial relationship with NATO. So the hypersonic missile that was in the news, yeah, that was aimed at one of the areas of Ukraine where NATO troops had previously trained in years past. So there has been a close cooperation, but not full membership, and that matters because you can't invoke Article 5 if you don't belong, right? And then the question is, what if they press forward? Would the United States, for example, say, sure, we'll take you into NATO? Or would they say, you know what, let's not poke the Russian bear by doing that? It's unclear.
I'd just like to point out that Switzerland is a neutral state, and they do not get managed by any external forces. They don't get invaded, they don't get bombed. So when you think about the meaning of a neutral state, it's not for Putin to say that it's only going to be neutral if he controls it. So that's just total propaganda, double talk.
Please.
I read in the news somewhere, this could just be someone coming up and spinning something off the top of their head for like fear-mongering or just kind of like likes or something, but there might be an assassination attempt on Putin with like poison or something. If that were the case, which from the sounds of it, doesn't sound like possible because he's surrounding himself by yes men, what would be the political fallout from that for Russia or for the entire EU as it is?
Okay. The question was, has there been an assassination attempt on Putin? And if Putin falls, what's the implication for the Russian Federation? I have not read anything about a possible assassination attempt. If you're looking for a good source of news, here's a good one. Meduza, M-E-D-U-Z-A, out of Latvia. This is a group of Russian expats who've fled because there's no freedom of speech anymore. Most of them are journalists, and they report in Russian and in English on this website, Meduza. They broke the story, for example, about Putin arresting the foreign chief of the FSB, right? I've seen nothing in Meduza about this, so I think the answer is no. If Putin were to be killed or toppled, what would that mean? It's not clear. Most of the oligarchs are yes men, sycophants, but if I had to say which one of the oligarchs might rise to power, my bet would be Mikhail Prodorovsky, who used to own the New Jersey Nets, the basketball team. He made his money in Norilsk Nickel. The story is, and I don't know if it's true, that Putin forced him to sell the New Jersey Nets. He said, prove your loyalty to Russia. A good Russian oligarch doesn't own an NBA team. And he actually had talked about running against Putin in a previous presidential election and then decided maybe he shouldn't. But, you know, Putin's very short, 5 whatever, not particularly charismatic. Mikhail Prokhorov, he's 6'8", just this goofy, lovable guy, or so it seems. So I think many Russian people would like him as president. He's very pro-West. Who knows? Anybody else?
Yeah. You know, as historians, you often have to be careful about historical precedents, you know, and comparisons, because everything in some sense is unprecedented. So in your view, this conflict, what is it that's unprecedented about this situation that makes it unique and different from anything that's ever happened before? And in what sense does that, what is different about the situation that might not lead to Putin falling like has happened in the past?
Yeah, that's a very good question. There are lots of different ways you could go, but I think I would go to the level of disinformation. I mean, of course, there's always been in the modern age propaganda. There's always been attempts at disinformation and misinformation. But Putin has created a truly alternate world. There are some incredible stories of Russians who happen to be living in Ukraine. So, for example, there was a story of a young woman in her 20s living in Kharkiv. And she talked to her mother in Moscow. And she said, "Mom, the Russians are bombing my apartment building." And her mother said, No, that has to be the Ukrainians. You must be mistaken, right? They can't really be bombing." And she literally, this mother, chose to believe the propaganda on TV over her own daughter on the ground in Ukraine. And there are all kinds of stories like this, right? There is a total control of information in Russia. And I would say, I don't know, have we ever seen that level of control of information before? That, to me, might be unprecedented, maybe. Great question.
Can I interrupt for a second?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Like to add,
Yeah, go ahead.
something to what you just said, because it's not just misinformation within the Russian. You would be amazed how many people living here in the United States or all over the world who still believe the Russian television because that's what they watch, and it's incredible because they do have the resources and they are able to watch us on TV. And, however they prefer and they choose to believe what they see on the Russian television. So it's a very powerful network, to say the least.
Yes, and thank you, Oksana. And of course, we have in the United States, although I think DirecTV was in negotiations and may not stay on the DirecTV network, but Russia Today, RT, right? This is a pro-Kremlin mouthpiece. And at least over the last 5 years, I hope not anymore, was one of the fastest growing TV networks in America. And particularly popular on the right, right? And a lot of people didn't fully understand this is basically Putin TV, right? You're here in the United States.
Larry King moved from CNN to Russia Today. The ex-governor of Minnesota moved from CNN to Russia Today. They thought that Putin was a jerk. They had to do 10% propaganda, but the rest, they just went wild. But my original question had to do with propaganda in the United States. And ever since I went to MIT and met people from 100 different countries, I've been investigating propaganda everywhere. And with the Freedom of Information Act, we now know the CIA Black Op combined with Winston Churchill's MI6 Black Op destroyed the democracy in Iran and installed a puppet dictator who tortured and murdered thousands of pro-democracy people.
Yeah.
Which is the basis of terrorism in Iran today, because if they had stayed with the democracy, essentially our puppet dictator killed all the pro-democracy people. All that was left were the radical jihadists.
Yeah.
And it was inevitable they were going to kick him out.
Mm-hmm.
So how many Americans do you think even bothered to fight off the propaganda on that and know that that's true? I haven't found anyone in North Carolina that knows that that's true.
Yeah. Oh, it's maybe the single most important problem that we're facing today, right? How to deal with misinformation. It's extremely problematic.
So we have it in the U.S. too.
Yes, of course, yes. Okay, maybe a couple more questions.
So one thing that interested me was the picture of Putin at his big rally. His job was to be an intelligence officer in the KGB. So do you think that he's picked up cues from like Donald Trump on how to, like, whip up his base in Russia and support for this?
I've forgotten which, I think it was Sean Hannity on Fox News, who said after Putin's rally, that was his best Trump attempt at a mass rally. So Hannity himself made that link between Trump's massive rallies and Putin's. The main difference, I would say, between Trump's big rallies and this one is that there are widespread reports that people who work for the government or who attend state universities were told, either you go to that stadium and wave the flag and cheer Putin, or you're fired from your job and you're expelled from the university. Right? There are a lot of reports. People were forced to go to that rally. Whereas certainly in our case, right, people of their own volition go to a Trump rally. But yeah, there are similarities there, right, in terms of the slogans and the symbols, the pageantry, but that's kind of part of modernity, right? Okay, maybe one more question.
No one else? On Trump, I've researched him too. His ex-wife testified that his bedside reading was the collected speeches of Adolf Hitler. So I think that Putin had the same literature somewhere in his house. I think there's parallel studies of how to rally the base based on what worked for Hitler. And I've seen video of Putin youth camps, which are totally modeled on Hitler youth camps from the Nazi era.
Yes.
So I think Trump was a parallel. I don't think that Putin learned from Trump. I think they both learned it independently.
Yeah, and clearly one of the ironies of Putin talking about denazifying Ukraine or fascism in Ukraine is that if anybody here is acting like a Nazi and a fascist, it's Putin himself, right?
Yeah, watch the video of
Yeah.
the youth camps. It's identical to Hitler.
Yep. Okay.
I'd like to do one last point that I think we really do need to talk about, and that is the relationship between China and Russia.
Yes.
It's completely unprecedented in the history of the world.
Yes. Okay. This is indeed a great thing to end on. In my opinion, one of the aspects of this conflict that is woefully underreported is that the Chinese, for about the last 10 years or so, have been methodically and strategically forming partnerships with the countries of Eastern Europe as part of the Chinese so-called Belt and Road Initiative, or the New Silk Road Project, as it's sometimes called. For example, there is a Belt and Road Initiative in Riga, right? It's funded by the Chinese. They were talking about funding a railway across Ukraine as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So one of the things that I find particularly perplexing is, given this long-term plan that the Chinese have been working on, why is it that Xi Jinping continues, at this point anyway, to not condemn what Putin is doing in the region, which is really screwing up their long-term plan? And it would seem, yeah, certainly if I were president, I would really be on the phone a lot with Xi Jinping. But unfortunately, our prior president, Donald Trump, has made the Chinese-American relationship a pretty fraught one, right? And at this point, the Chinese are maintaining more or less a pretty quiet stance, and if they say anything, it is a pro-Russian statement. But I agree, if the Chinese were to change their tune, that would really, really make a difference. Maybe one last thing to note. Why don't we see the blue helmets, the United Nations peacekeepers in Ukraine? Here is why, right? On the Security Council, the permanent members have a veto vote. And Russia is a permanent member, right? So anytime there's a proposal to send in peacekeepers, usually this happens in the Security Council, Russia will veto it every time. There is an alternative. And it happened once in history from the Suez Canal crisis in 1956. that the General Assembly of the United Nations can organize a peacekeeping mission. But to do this, we have to have Chinese support. And that's another reason why we really need the Chinese to come on board to help us end this conflict. Okay, thank you so much for coming. I wish you all a pleasant evening. Take care.